Hey guys, welcome to part 3 of 10 JRPGs that aged really well. Same rule as before, the game needs to be at least 20 years old to be on the list, so let's begin. Number 10, Terranigma. This is a beautifully looking action RPG that only came out in Japan and Europe. One look at the graphics and animations and you can already tell it aged well. Since Terranigma was the last of the Quintet trilogy of action RPGs, obviously they improved the controls and the battle system a bit. They did so in a way that still feels fun to play nowadays. There's a few attacks and different skills to perform, all controlled by the player, so it may feel kinda clunky, but you gotta understand it's a video game from 1996, and not one with a Squaresoft level of budget. Well, ironically, a lot of Squaresoft RPGs with all their budget didn't age very well, did they? Terranigma also has interesting dungeon design and puzzles that aren't infuriating like in some other RPGs of its time. No random encounters, obviously you can see the enemies around and there aren't many. Overall, this one is definitely a JRPG that aged really well. Too bad it's 2023 and it still hasn't been released in North America. Number 9, Tactics Ogre, The Knight of Lodis. You think a game in an isometric view wouldn't age well? The first game in the series was released on the Super Famicom and then on PS1. It aged alright, sure, but it shows its age. The Knight of Lodis was developed for the Game Boy Advance. The console everyone knows is basically a portable Super Nintendo. The colors look brighter, with more pixels this time around, and movement is as simple as it gets. It has the same controls most tactical RPGs played on grids have. The performance isn't slow since it never used AAA graphics of that era. They're extremely simple too, but without feeling low quality, which means the interface is fast, responding in a natural way to the player's actions without delay. Even the animations still look good enough to make you wonder if it's a modern indie RPG with a decent budget or an old fart from the early 2000s. I think a lot of SNES games aged greatly because of reasons like this, so it's only logical to think many GBA titles will be the same. The majority of them have already aged well or will age well, this one being no exception. Number 8, Popful Mail. These games are not choice for this video, I know. First because it may or may not be considered as an action RPG since it's mostly a platformer with Metroidvania elements, and second because this particular Sega CD version was another victim of Working Design's shenanigans. They made it way harder than the original. Thankfully, there's a fan translation of the original versions on Sega CD and Super Famicom way more balanced. It aged really well. Like most 2D side-scrollers of this era, running, jumping and fighting around still feels great. There's a lot of dialogue for a game like this, but that's one of the reasons why I think of it as an action RPG, but it's debatable. Perhaps it should have been included in this video, huh? You mostly play as Popful, but eventually 2 party members will join you and you'll be able to switch to them. They control differently, but none feels clunky or dated. Sure, there's no combo system like in Terranigma, but it's a game more based on the methods to defeat the bosses and the patterns, rather than the button mashing. Graphics still look absolutely gorgeous, and the level design, while not without its problems, it's still pretty decent. I hope we get some kind of re-release of this game for modern systems one day, I really do. Number 7, Illusion of Gaia. This one precedes Terranigma, but it still looks fantastic. Everything about its pixel art and animations to its area design and controls still feel enjoyable. It's almost irrelevant, but I also think the dialogue boxes are much better than the super small subtitles some modern action games have. The whole game controls nicely, it was never a big budget game and it still looked as good as Chrono Trigger or Super Mario RPG. Now, the controls during exploration and combat are special. You see, in this game, you've got 3 different characters to control, each with their own moves, skills, and, well, controls. They all feel great, especially this guy who's just floating around. You can only move in 4 directions, but it feels sometimes as if they were 8. Look how fast the interface loads between areas or menus. I know it's nothing impressive because a lot of games from this era were the same, but that's one of the reasons they aged so well. Now, this game does have some annoying puzzles, but you can still find their type in a lot of modern titles, so we shouldn't judge it from that. This is a great game. Number 6, Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. This little RPG series made its origins on the Game Boy Advance back in 2003, but it was until November, so... Is it breaking my rule? Oh, come on, give me a break, it's only 4 months. Here you just control both characters one at a time to solve puzzles and make progress. It's basically a 2D game, so the visual department aged just as well as the controls. Even in combat, it doesn't feel old like many JRPGs of the 90s. The interface is pretty fast and responsive, like the menus for example. You can also execute timed button presses to make your attacks more powerful. The same can be done to defend or avoid enemy attacks. It's a pretty fun turn-based RPG that aged really well. Plus, like I said, it's a Mario game in 2D, and the large majority of those, no matter the era, aged surprisingly well. Number 5, Lunar, the Silver Star Story. This game was originally released on the Sega CD. Believe it or not, that version also aged decently, but the super small characters and the high encounter rate might turn you off. A slightly better version of it is available on the PS1. It's still fully in 2D with chibi characters, but the encounter rate I felt was less annoying. Perhaps it's the one thing about the game that didn't age well, but the rest definitely did, and it was also rebalanced. Navigation, movement, controls, and the graphics you experience make everything still pleasant nowadays. The whole interface is quick and loading times are just fine. It's hard to believe considering the PS1 era was known for taking its sweet time to load battles. Combat menus are quick and easy to navigate through, the animations look as charming as they did back then, but the battles themselves can take a bit of time thanks to this. Even so, I still think the PS1 version aged alright. There's even another remake that's over 20 years old too, called Lunar Legend on the Game Boy Advance. I think everything looks shrunk as opposed to the characters, which is weird, and some things are kinda different than the previous versions, but it also aged decently. Number 4, Lunar 2 Eternal Blue. Of course the sequel will be included in this video, the exact same graphic engine was used for both versions after all. The Sega CD one has the same issues as the first Lunar, so it's no surprise I'm gonna say it isn't the best version to play of it. Once again, its PS1 remake aged much better. However, both remakes share the same characteristics, so if random encounters, chibi characters, and slower than usual battles turn you off, you might want to wait if this sequel gets miraculously remade again or at least remastered. Both have only in Japan versions on the Sega Saturn, but I haven't played them, so I don't know if those aged well. The first one is also on Windows, iOS, GBA like I said, and PSP even. The PSP remake is my preferred version to play of it. Eternal Blue sadly didn't meet the GBA or the PSP, Windows, or even the freaking iOS. So its original releases are the only ones out there. Like I said though, the PS1 remake aged just fine, so there you go, nothing to worry about. Number 3, Wild Arms. Wild Arms is tricky. A lot of it aged well except for one thing, but we'll get to it. The thing about this RPG is that a big part of it was planned for the Super Nintendo. Sony and MediaVision were planning to release it late for the console, but along came the PS1 in 1994 to offer a much better home for it. Development then switched to it, and 3 years later, this little gem was born. So you move around in graphics that are well in 2D, which makes them look beautiful nowadays. Same with all related to exploration, it just doesn't feel as dated as it should, or sluggish for that matter. Combat is responsive like its whole interface, including the menus. But the polygons is the one thing that didn't age well. They're starting to show their age, aren't they? Thankfully, Sony released this game digitally on PS4 and 5, and well, take a look at the characters. They look much better now in my opinion. The same can be said about the sequel, but only in that regard. Since the polygons were bigger and the camera was primitive, despite being a better game, it didn't age as well. Number 2, Ark the Lad, Twilight of the Spirits. This JRPG is fully in 3D and it's supposed to take place 1000 years after the PS1 trilogy. It was released in early 2003, developed by Cat & Call and published by Sony, so there was a budget for its production alright, but not enough to make it look this impressive on the PS2. Later, it was released on the PS4 digitally, and this is how it looks in there. Even better, right? Graphically speaking, upscaling games, even if it's just a bit, can show you how they actually aged. But what about the controls, the combat, you know, all of those technicalities? Well, forget about random encounters since this is a strategy RPG. You may get some in the overview map, but most of the time, the game itself takes you to the missions. This is a reason why a lot of strategy RPGs aged well. But how is the performance and the interface of this one? Pretty good actually. Moving around feels normal, almost as if you were playing a modern game, especially on its PS4 digital release. The magic of the PS2 is that it laid the basis of these types of controls in 3D environments, so naturally the video game industry followed in later generations. Arc the Lad 4 is a good example of this, with character models still looking decent after 20 years. Number 1. Xenosaga Episode I. Most of you probably don't know this game dates all the way back to 2002. It took Namco a whole year to localize it to North America on February of 2003. The reason why this may surprise you a little is because of how the game still looks. It was ahead of its time, especially since its development began in early 2000. Also, the budget for this game was over $7 million, and of course it shows. This gameplay footage you're seeing right now is in 720p, which is not the game's native resolution. The original will be 480i, although in reality it used a 512 by 448 resolution, so we wouldn't have to sacrifice that much frame rate. That's why you see Cosmos right here running around very smoothly, no lag whatsoever. Despite that resolution though, Xenosaga still looked fantastic back then on a simple CRT from that era. And yes, everything is fully in 3D, so for an early JRPG of its time, it aged marvelously. Moving around might still look slow, but it isn't. The area design let the player move freely with a still camera, precisely to avoid the big mistake Xenogears did. Finally, combat is awesome, and if it's somewhat slow, it's because it was designed to be that way, to make you strategize a bit more than in your average turn-based RPG. Still, a remaster of the whole trilogy will be the ideal outcome, but since that's likely never to happen, stick to the originals. Episode 1 aged really well. This video was sponsored by my own books, available in both physical and digital formats in Amazon, link in the description. Alright, those were some more retro RPGs that aged really well. If you think others I didn't mention aged well, leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching, do me a favor and don't forget to subscribe, and see you next time!